Imagine for a moment that you time travel back to the year 1350. You wake up in a medieval village and decide you're going to live exactly like an average citizen of that era. You follow all their customs, adopt all their traditions, and especially practice all their sexual habits that were considered completely normal and socially acceptable. Now imagine returning to 2025 and trying to explain to a modern police officer why you thought any of that was okay. Spoiler alert, you'd be arrested before you could finish your first explanation. Welcome to one of the most disturbing revelations in history, the sexual practices that our ancestors considered not just normal but morally obligatory today constitute serious crimes that would send you straight to federal prison. And I'm not talking about minor cultural differences. I'm talking about behaviors that would make a modern prosecutor's eyes light up while drafting a list of felony charges that would include some very, very ugly words. Today we're going to uncover 7 medieval sexual habits so brutally unacceptable by modern standards that they'll make you question everything you thought you knew about the progress of human civilization. Because it turns out our ancestors weren't simply different in their sexual practices. They were, by modern legal definition, mass criminals. Prepare to discover why what medieval people called normal marriage customs would today be classified as organized crime, why their approach to consent would make a federal judge order immediate psychiatric evaluation, and why their sexual practices would result in sentences that would keep you behind bars for multiple lifetimes. Because after this story, you'll understand that the gap between medieval and modern sexual ethics isn't just a cultural difference, it's the difference between what we now recognize as civilization and what we would prosecute as systematic human rights violations. Let's start with something that will immediately make your stomach turn. In medieval society, child marriage wasn't just accepted. It was considered smart economic planning and morally superior to waiting for adulthood. And when I say child marriage, I'm not talking about teenagers. I'm talking about girls as young as 7, 8, 9 years old being betrothed and subsequently consummated with adult men. The official age of consent in medieval Europe was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But in practice, these ages were considered suggestions rather than absolute requirements. Parish records are filled with marriages where brides were between 8 and 10 years old, and these marriages were considered especially virtuous because they preserved purity before girls could become corrupted. Take the documented case of Margaret Beaufort, mother of future King Henry VII of England. She was first married at age 6 to John de la Pole, but that marriage was annulled when she was 8, so she could be married to Edmund Tudor, who was 25. The marriage was consummated immediately, and Margaret became pregnant at 12. She gave birth to Henry VII at 13, and the trauma of childbirth left her sterile for life. But here's what will really break you. This wasn't considered child abuse. It was considered responsible family planning. Parents who didn't marry off their daughters before age 10 were criticized by the community for wasting fertile years and exposing them to sinful temptations. Marriage negotiations for princesses included clauses that would make a human trafficking contract seem generous. Parents specified everything from how many children she should bear to what would happen to her if she failed to fulfill her reproductive obligations. And if you think I'm exaggerating, let me tell you about Catherine of Aragon's marriage contract. When Catherine was betrothed to Prince Arthur of England, the contract specified that if she didn't produce a male heir within the first 3 years, she could be returned to Spain as defective merchandise. Imagine the terror of that 15-year-old girl, knowing that her value as a human being depended entirely on her reproductive capacity. The marriage manual most popular at the time, De Secretis Mulierum, contained entire chapters on how to determine if a girl was ready for marriage. The criteria included physical development, but also emotional docility and capacity for submission, characteristics that medieval doctors believed developed best when marital education began before age 10. In modern society, any adult who followed these practices would be charged with child sexual abuse, forced marriage, statutory rape, and probably a dozen other charges that would result in decades of federal prison time. But for our medieval ancestors, not doing this was considered parental negligence. Modern court records show that even today, when these practices are discovered in isolated communities maintaining medieval traditions, perpetrators receive life sentences. In 2019, a man in Texas was sentenced to life in prison for following what he called historical marriage traditions that turned out to be exactly these medieval practices. In the medieval world, the concept that a husband could rape his wife was literally incomprehensible. There was no vocabulary for this idea because it was considered a logical contradiction. Once a woman married, her body legally belonged to her husband, and he had absolute right to sexual access at any time, in any way, under any circumstances. Medieval legal codes specified that wives who refused their husband's sexual demands were committing both mortal sin and legal crime. They could be punished with fines, imprisonment, and even public corporal punishment. In many jurisdictions, a husband had the legal right to physically correct a wife who resisted his sexual advances. The most influential legal manual of the period, Las Siete Partidas by Alfonso X of Castile, clearly stated that the woman who denies her body to her husband without cause of grave illness commits a crime against marriage and may be punished as befits such an offense. Appropriate corrections included beatings, food deprivation, and confinement. But here's what will really chill your blood. These codes also established that a husband had the right to force his wife even during pregnancy, menstruation, and while recovering from childbirth. The only times a wife could legally deny sexual access were during illnesses that posed danger to the husband's life, like leprosy or plague. Court records from the period show cases where wives were brought to trial for marital resistance and sentenced to public punishment. In 1348, a woman in Canterbury was publicly whipped for refusing to have sex with her husband while recovering from a difficult childbirth. The judge declared that her unnatural resistance was evidence of demonic influence. In modern legal terms, every one of these acts constitutes marital rape, a crime that in most jurisdictions carries sentences of 5 to 25 years. The United States didn't fully criminalize marital rape until 1993, and many European countries didn't do so until the early 2000s. But the medieval normalization of sexual violence went beyond individual marriages. It was a systematic legal framework that made consent irrelevant within marriage and treated women's bodies as property that men had purchased through marriage contracts. While historians debate whether this practice was as common as legends suggest, legal records confirm that jus primae noctis, or right of the first night, existed and was regularly exercised by feudal lords throughout Europe. This legal right established that a feudal lord could spend the first night with any newly married woman on his lands before she could be with her husband. Records from the Duchy of Brittany contain dozens of cases where feudal lords exercised this right with women who had just married their serfs. The process was so institutionalized that there were specific protocols. The bride was escorted to the lord's castle on her wedding night, remained there until dawn, and was then returned to her husband to continue with her marriage. But here's the part that will destroy your soul. Women who tried to resist or hide were hunted down by the Lord's guards and brought by force. Families who tried to interfere were punished with severe fines, loss of land, or expulsion from the feudal domains. In some cases, husbands who tried to protect their wives were executed for rebellion against feudal order. The legal code known as Customs of Brittany specified that this right could be exercised not just on the wedding night, but also when the lord deems it appropriate during the first year of marriage. Some feudal lords exercised this right multiple times with the same woman, effectively keeping her as a forced concubine while pretending she was temporarily borrowed from her husband. Records from the Abbey of Saint-Denis contain a petition from 1392, where village inhabitants begged the king to intervene because their local lord had been exercising the right of first night so frequently that many women were developing what the documents describe as severe melancholy and refusal to eat. In modern terms, these women were suffering severe psychological trauma from repeated rapes. In modern society, every exercise of the right of first night would constitute rape, kidnapping, and probably sex trafficking. Feudal lords who practiced this regularly would be classified as serial rapists and receive multiple life sentences. The guards who helped would be charged as accomplices in sexual crimes, and communities that allowed it would be investigated for criminal conspiracy. Now, if you're finding these revelations about medieval sexual practices as disturbing as they are important for understanding how far we've come, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more historical truths that will make you value every legal protection we have today. In most medieval European cities, municipal brothels regularly employed girls between 12 and 15 years old, and this was considered not just legal, but socially beneficial. It was believed that providing appropriate outlets for male sexual impulses protected virtuous women from sexual assault and maintained social order. Municipal records from 14th century Avignon show that the city brothel employed 32 women, of whom 16 were under 15 years old. These girls were typically contracted by their own families, who received payments for renting their daughters to the establishment. Contracts specified that the girls would work until age 25 or until they married, whichever came first. But here's what will really make you sick. These brothels had specific regulations about how to treat underage workers. Rules included prohibitions against permanent physical harm and requirements that girls receive appropriate rest on Sundays to attend Mass, as if providing one day off made the sexual exploitation of children morally acceptable. The municipal brothel in Toulouse had a system where girls between 12 and 14 were reserved for clients who paid premium prices for renewed virginity. Girls were subjected to regular medical procedures to restore their virginity, a process that medieval medical documents describe in details that would make a modern surgeon vomit. Tax records show that these brothels contributed significantly to municipal revenues. The city of Paris collected the equivalent of millions of modern dollars annually in taxes from establishments employing minors. This money was used to finance public projects, including churches and schools, creating an economy where child sexual exploitation literally built community infrastructure. In modern society, anyone involved in these systems would be charged with child sex trafficking, sexual exploitation of minors, and organized crime. Sentences would be decades in federal prison, and names would appear on sex offender registries for life. Medieval marriage by capture functioned exactly as it sounds. A man could legally force marriage with a woman by kidnapping her, raping her, and then declaring they were now united by consummation. Once this occurred, the woman had few legal options except to accept the marriage or face complete social ostracism. Germanic legal codes contained specific provisions for marriage by capture. If a man could keep a woman kidnapped for 3 days and 3 nights without being rescued by her family, the marriage was considered legally valid. The process was so systematic that there were official protocols for announcing the kidnapping to local authorities to make the marriage official. English court records from the 13th century contain dozens of cases where women were maritally captured and then had to seek annulment of marriages they had never consented to. The legal process for annulment was so complicated and expensive that most women simply accepted their fate. But here's the most twisted part. The families of captured women often ended up accepting these marriages because the alternative was having a dishonored daughter who would be unmarriageable through conventional means. The system was designed so that rape became a viable method of marriage acquisition. Scottish nobility records show that marriage by capture was so common among powerful families that it had become a form of aggressive diplomacy. Clans used marital kidnapping as a way to force political alliances, capturing daughters of rival families to create involuntary family connections. In 1436, MacLeod clan records document a capture season where 6 young women from rival families were kidnapped in a 2-month period to force strategic marriages. The affected families eventually accepted these marriages after months of negotiations, because rejecting them would have meant admitting their daughters had been contaminated without political benefit. In modern legal terms, every instance of marriage by capture would constitute kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, and forced marriage. Perpetrators would face multiple federal charges resulting in life sentences, and they would be classified as violent sexual predators. Medieval households regularly employed young girls as domestic servants, under conditions that were essentially sexual slavery with legal protection. These arrangements were so normalized that they were regulated by guild laws and protected by municipal authorities. Wealthy households would contract girls as young as 10 years old for domestic service that explicitly included sexual availability to the male head of household and his male relatives. These contracts were legal documents that specified the girl's sexual obligations alongside her domestic duties. The girls, typically from poor families, were bound to these households for terms that could last 10 to 15 years. They had no legal right to refuse sexual advances from their employers, no right to leave the household, and no legal recourse if they became pregnant from the abuse. Records from merchant households in Venice show that sexual access to domestic servants was considered a standard benefit of employment for male family members. Households would advertise the availability and youth of their female servants when seeking to attract business partners or political allies. When these girls became pregnant from their abuse, they faced additional exploitation. Their children became the property of the household, and the girls were often forced to serve as wet nurses for their own children while continuing their sexual servitude to the men who had fathered them. The legal system provided no protection for these girls. They were considered property of the household, and any attempt to escape was treated as theft, specifically theft of the household's investment in their training and upkeep. In modern terms, these arrangements constitute child sex trafficking, sexual slavery, and organized exploitation. Every person involved in these systems would be prosecuted under federal human trafficking laws with sentences of 25 years to life. Medieval nobility regularly practiced marriage arrangements that would today be classified as incest and child abuse. Royal and noble families created complex marriage networks between close relatives, including uncle-niece marriages, first-cousin marriages, and marriages between step-relatives that began when the participants were children. These incestuous marriages weren't accidental or occasional. They were deliberate political strategies to concentrate wealth and power within family lines. Families would plan these marriages generations in advance, often betrothing children to their own relatives while they were still infants. The psychological and physical trauma inflicted on children forced into these arrangements was devastating, but it was considered a necessary sacrifice for family political advancement. Girls as young as 8 were told they would marry their uncles or cousins, and were prepared for these marriages through grooming that started in early childhood. Genetic records show that these incestuous marriage practices led to widespread birth defects, mental illness, and infant mortality among noble families. But rather than stopping the practice, families simply accepted the high rates of disability and death as the cost of maintaining political power. Church records contain dispensations for hundreds of these incestuous marriages, showing that religious authorities not only tolerated but actively facilitated these arrangements in exchange for political influence and monetary payments. In modern society, arranging marriages between close relatives would constitute child abuse, sexual exploitation, and conspiracy to commit incest. The adults involved would face serious criminal charges, and the children would be removed from their families by protective services. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by the scope of sexual criminality that was considered normal in medieval society, definitely subscribe for more revelations about how historical practices that seemed normal were actually systematic human rights violations. But here we arrive at the most disturbing realization of this entire exploration. These sexual practices weren't aberrations committed by a few evil individuals. They were the normal, accepted, and legally protected behaviors of an entire civilization that lasted for centuries. The people who practiced these habits didn't consider themselves monsters. They considered themselves morally upright citizens following sacred traditions passed down from their ancestors. They genuinely believed these practices were not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining social order and moral purity. This is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of this exploration: the normalization of horror. When atrocious behaviors become institutionalized for long enough, people develop complete moral frameworks to justify them. They don't just become acceptable, they become virtuous. Medieval religious manuals contain sermons where priests praised parents for marrying off young daughters to protect their purity. They contained special blessings for husbands who appropriately corrected resistant wives. They contained prayers of gratitude for feudal lords who maintained order through exercise of their seigneurial rights. Legal records show that people who tried to resist or reform these systems were seen as dangerous radicals threatening social stability. Women who spoke against child marriage were accused of heresy. Men who questioned the right of first night were labeled as rebels. Families who tried to protect their daughters from marriage by capture were seen as antisocial. This leads us to a chilling conclusion. If you or I had been born into medieval society, Statistically, we would have participated in these systems. We would have arranged child marriages for our daughters. We would have exercised or accepted marital rape as normal. We would have tolerated or participated in institutionalized sexual exploitation. And the most terrifying part, we would have slept well at night, convinced we were moral people living virtuous lives according to the standards of our time. Modern psychological studies on social conformity show that the vast majority of people adopt the moral values of their society without critical questioning. The famous experiments like Milgram's obedience study and the Stanford prison experiment demonstrate that ordinary people can participate in atrocious acts when those acts are presented as normal or necessary by authority figures. This means that the horrors we've just explored weren't the result of societies filled with psychopaths. They were the result of social systems that normalized cruelty and called it virtue. And that's much more terrifying than any individual monster, because it means that monstrosity can be systematic, institutional, and invisible to the people living within it. So there you have it. 7 medieval sexual habits that wouldn't just land you in prison today. They would make you infamous as one of the most vile criminals in modern history. Child marriage, marital rape, sexual feudal rights, institutionalized child prostitution, marriage by capture, sexual slavery, and incestuous family networks. But perhaps the most important lesson isn't how terrible our ancestors were. It's how vulnerable human civilization is to the normalization of horror. It's how easy it is for entire societies to lose their moral compass when powerful institutions redefine cruelty as virtue. The next time you hear someone talk romantically about the good old days, or complain that modern values are too progressive, remember that the values we defend today, consent, child protection, equal rights, are extraordinary human achievements that our ancestors would have considered radical and dangerous. Remember that every legal protection we take for granted was gained through centuries of struggle against systems that considered normal what we recognize as atrocities. And remember that maintaining these achievements requires constant vigilance, because history shows us that societies can backslide into barbarism with terrifying speed when we don't actively protect the values that define us as civilized. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to appreciate the fact that I live in an era where all the practices we just discussed are recognized as serious crimes rather than virtuous traditions. I'm going to value the miracle of living in a society that protects children, criminalizes rape, and recognizes consent as a fundamental human right. Because after diving into this historical nightmare of normalized horror, I think we can all be deeply grateful to have been born in an era where being a sexual criminal lands you in prison, not in church being blessed for your traditional virtues. And if you made it to the end of this revelation, as disturbing as it is necessary, tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. We're fascinated to know that these difficult truths about our past are reaching people around the world who share our commitment to facing history as it was, not as we wish it had been.